Every day, I'm feeling like the superhero genre is less and less for me. Obviously, the MCU specifically has been around for a long time, almost 20 years at this point. So I and the rest of my generation are going to grow up and have a different relationship with these movies. But there's no single reason that I can pinpoint as to why the quality has just seemed to drop off so dramatically. And I've always had this basic understanding that the MCU wasn't going to be masterpiece in filmmaking, and therefore the films that were trying to copy it weren't going to be, but I could accept that they were fun and they were an opportunity to look at myself differently. All of that has kind of faded. To look back and see where exactly it all went wrong, I had to look at my beginnings with the superhero genre. I've always liked superheroes since I was little, and I remember going to see the first Iron Man in theaters like it was yesterday. This means that as I was growing up, it was actually cool to get into superheroes. There was no chance of me falling off because I didn't want to look like I was into that stuff. It also helped that there were so many peak superhero shows when I was a kid, specifically Young Justice, Spectacular Spider-Man, and Avengers Earth's Mightiest Heroes. It cultivated this environment, this brief period where superhero content was just more mature, even in animated form. During this time, the showrunners really wanted to tell complex stories that spanned a whole season instead of like brief one-off silly adventures, which became more of a theme of content from the mid-2010s to 2020. So while the movies were just your average popcorn flick, the animated shows required me to think a little bit more than a SpongeBob or a Phineas and Ferb. But as I got a little older, like 7, 8 years old, they started replacing these shows with shows that more emulated the MCU, or at least the tone of it. Shows like Ultimate Spider-Man, or Avengers Assemble, or the Guardians of the Galaxy series. And obviously, I didn't identify with those series even half as much. So by this time, I was already wondering, where can I get, better material? And this resulted in me going straight to the source with collecting comic books for myself. There was a comic book store right there in my neighborhood, and I was confused as to why everyone wasn't going there, but comic books themselves were still largely uncool. That didn't really mean shit to me, so I took my ass to the comic book store almost every week. I got more into DC Comics at the time because they were having a rebrand called the New 52, and that means that they were just dominating the shelves, even with the popularity of Marvel in the movies. For anyone listening to this that has ever gotten into comics or has thought about getting into comics, you're going to have to sift through a lot of bullshit to get to the good stuff, which is something you obviously wouldn't have to do in a movie, which is trimmed down for maximum enjoyment. But that just goes to show you that people who like comic books or collecting in general, they probably just have a little more time to kill, and they're probably willing to sift through the garbage a little bit more. Another thing that I realized is that even though I love comics and superhero movies, many of them I didn't actually see in theaters. For example, the first 3 X-Men films, the first 3 Spider-Man films, and the first 2 Fantastic Four films all released before I was 3 years old. This means that by the time I was 5 or 6, these were the shows that were always playing constantly on TV. So I had the chance to analyze these films, 20 plus times from start to finish, see what was good about them, what was terrible about them, and how they connected to the source material. I was a bit of a sicko. When it comes to the MCU, I didn't see any of the Captain America films or the first 2 Guardians films in theaters. So these massive cultural shifts that everyone were experiencing when they went to the movies to see them, I didn't have the same experience. This, however, allowed me to watch them at home and really get to the bottom of these films. I didn't get caught up in the popcorn flick nature of just going to enjoy it. And to some extent, that's a good thing, and to some extent, that's a bad thing. To focus on the good, it means that I'm not just in it for a mindless adventure. I want actual characters, deep stakes, and long-lasting consequences. And if you're into the MCU, you know that that's not something that you really get with those movies. When you look back at the DCEU, the DC Extended Universe, it was just a dumpster fire in every imaginable way. And like I said, I had greater connection to those characters. So every movie was just a depressing misunderstanding of all of the characters that I loved. up until the Justice League movie, which just tried to be a cheap attempt at replicating the MCU. So with that understanding about what I liked about myself and what I enjoyed about comic books, it helped me to understand that superhero movies were never really meant for me in the first place. As a comic book fan, I was always going to see these movies no matter what. I want to see my favorite characters brought to life and what potential they have. But the goal of these movies is to appeal to the general audience, because without the general audience, you're not making $500 million, $250 million, or cracking that mark. So it was actually helpful for my enjoyment of these films to understand that a lot of things would either be changed to make things more palatable for the casual audience, or simply for time's sake, because things have to be condensed into a 2.5-hour movie. And I don't want this to become a rant about how superhero movies aren't exactly like the source material. I've just noticed that it becomes incredibly difficult to try and tell the same stories as comic book writers, because they have so much more freedom in what they can do and what they can create. That's why for a lot of heroes, when comic book fans are looking back at the things that they love about them, they don't analyze their entire history, but they analyze a few specific runs, because every writer's interpretation of the character can be slightly to very different, but there is almost guaranteed to be differences. You can't really get that in a corporatized movie universe. And that's another thing that hurts my enjoyment of these movies. I've always cared, perhaps a little bit too much, about being respected by a movie. I want a movie to know that I am a competent person that can follow complex storylines and piece things together and come up with fan theories and have those theories or those moments that I've watched in the movie actually pay off. The MCU doesn't really do that because it has to be safe. These are things that people have always pointed out about the MCU, but especially now, people are noticing how quippy the MCU is and how soft every consequence seems to be. If there is some type of long-lasting or should be long-lasting effect, it's immediately undone in the next movie just so they can get back to the status quo. Much like comics, but comics will just have a year or a 2-year period where you get to stay in those circumstances. The MCU isn't like that. And in many respects, it makes perfect sense why it's like that. If you're a 35-year-old dad with his kids and you just need something to do for even a couple of hours that they will sit down and shut up, a Marvel movie is the perfect choice. Not only do they follow what's going on, but you get some decent action, and at the end of the day, everybody had a good time. You really don't become profitable in the way Marvel movies have been unless it's literally for everybody. It was only natural that DC movies and a lot of other movies are just trying to emulate that feeling so they can emulate the success. Quick tangent, but I remember movies like Transformers 2 or the god-awful Last Airbender movie. I thought those movies were terrible when I first saw them out of the theater, and I realized that a lot of people my age also felt that way as a kid. They didn't have to watch a video essay to retroactively convince them they shouldn't like those movies. They were terrible. And in the case of Transformers, it still made a lot of money because that is far from the most important factor. My generation can accept that. But these companies also have to accept that it's only natural as I and the rest of the audience grow up that our tolerance for extremely middling or stepping stone content would decrease, especially post Avengers Endgame. I've only heard one person really talk about this, but the consistent strength of the MCU is also its biggest weakness right now, and it's the fact that any movie was a jumping off point. This means that you could literally pick up with any movie, and maybe at most you would need 2 to 3 sentences explaining what happened in the previous entry to understand perfectly what was happening and to feel invested. But simply from the way people talked about it, this was with the background knowledge that it was building to some ultimate threat. So after that threat has been eviscerated, most of the casual audience has gotten the satisfaction of a complete story, and naturally, their brains are going to ask them, what's next? So when you have a movie like Fantastic Four, the one that just released last year, it can perform well enough in the box office, but we know that the only reason it exists is so that they can put them in the next Avengers and get $2 billion once again. You could probably easily and fully enjoy the next Avengers film without having watched Fantastic Four. And that shouldn't be the case. It shouldn't be that I could get the same amount of enjoyment from reading an article that summarizes this movie instead of actually watching it. So this makes me wonder, am I just being overreactionary? Sturgeon's law states that 90% of everything is crap. So am I just choosing to willfully ignore the 10% that is good? I don't think so, because I genuinely feel that it's less than 10%. For example, I loved Superman, the one that released last year. It felt fresh, from the visuals to the character that's a symbol of hope, to the fact that other heroes just exist in the world. I don't need to be talked to and have every minor thing explained. The only other movie that made me feel like that in the last decade is another film by the same director, The Suicide Squad, which only existed because everything they attempted in the first one was a disaster. So out of the ashes of previous DC movies, better things are being produced. And I compare those movies to things like No Way Home or Deadpool and Wolverine. Those movies were admittedly extremely fun when I went to see them on opening weekend in the theaters. But upon a rewatch, it massively drops off in value. There's no way that you can honestly tell me those movies are even 25% of enjoyable if you don't understand every cameo and every reference and everything that's alluding to something that existed in the past. It has lost all of the effect of something being fresh or new because it depends on homework. And don't even get me started on movies like Thor, Love and Thunder or The Marvels. It's just a complete separation from everything that the fans want or expect. I remember when specifically the scene where they burst out into a Disney princess song in The Marvels, that's when I was finally thinking like, okay, I might have to throw in the towel, at least with the MCU. Those movies just left me and the rest of the audience wondering, who the hell is this even for? Since everything now absolutely has to be a cinematic universe, that kind of leaves very little room for something special. My favorite character in all of comics is Daredevil, and subsequently my favorite TV series of all time is the 2015 Daredevil series. At first, I kind of hated how much the Netflix characters didn't really interact with the rest of the MCU. I mean, they made their little references in the first couple of episodes, but I already knew that was as much as we were ever going to get. It was only when I got a greater understanding of how movies and branding works that I understood the only reason those shows have the space to be what they are is because they had very loose connections to the MCU. In the Marvel universe, you don't really have those down-to-earth stories that deal with serious topics, and especially not with the violence that's in the Netflix series. Not to mention, if everything had to be as streamlined as it is right now, there wouldn't even be enough episodes for a relationship like the one that builds between Matt Murdock and the Kingpin in the original show. With that being my favorite show though, you'd think that I'd be extremely excited by the idea of all the actors coming back from a sequel series. But no, because if you're one of those people that enjoyed the show, you were probably in the realm of news to understand what was happening behind the scenes before the show even got made. And if you heard those details, you probably thought the show was going to be a disaster. Essentially, they wanted to ignore 90% of what happened in the previous series or kill off all of the characters. When those details leaked, people obviously had a huge negative response towards all of that, and it was only afterwards that they decided that wasn't really going to work. And you could still see a lot of hints of that in season 1 of Born Again, where a lot of things simply don't add up if you're comparing it to things that happened in the last series. I've heard some people argue that season 2 of Born Again has reached the same quality as the original series, and that just proves to me that you're the exact kind of person Disney wants consuming their content, because the only thing you probably know about the original series is what you've consumed through Twitter clips or video essays. The extended scenes, the fight choreography, the character work, all of that in Born Again is of not only a different show, but of just worse quality all around. Even the simple practice of releasing on a week-to-week schedule changes how the story is written, because now the entire goal is keeping you along the ride until you reach the season finale. As everything becomes this homogenized glob, it just reinforces the belief I have that superhero in itself should not be a genre. It should be way more normal that properties can adapt comic book characters, but each property is treated with individual respect to another genre. For example, a Justice League dark film could be a super intense horror film, while a Martian Manhunter series might be a detective drama. We actually see this in two of the best superhero movies ever created, in Captain America: The Winter Soldier, which is a political thriller, and Logan, which is a western focused on the relationship between man and child. Each of those movies does a better job at capturing the essence of the hero than, honestly, that I've seen in any other comic book film at the top of my head. The only time I really see directors put the idea of each superhero movie being judged in its own merits is when they want to strip down the story or avoid actual world building. Like in the Batman 2022. That movie is a 3-hour crime drama that doesn't really have any twist, and it's like, we just spent the previous Batman trilogy with absolutely zero supernatural elements. Would it kill you to be more creative and evolve the Batman lore into a current modern adaptation? The character of the Riddler is such a deviation from what we've seen in comics and media that they would have been better off just using a different character. Even Logan is a massively stripped down version of the comic Old Man Logan. At the point of recording this video, I haven't even seen Supergirl, but I have read the Woman of Tomorrow comic, which it was supposedly based on. By all accounts, the movie is boring, uninspired, and poorly written, and it can barely be labeled an adaptation of what I read. There seems to be such a lack of focus on the fact that movies are a visual medium, and one of the most gorgeous comics doesn't have any representation in the film version. And like I said, I haven't seen the film for myself, but if every measure of the movie just boils down to people being confused as to how this generic slop is the second movie in the DC universe, then I can gladly wait until it hits streaming. At the end of the day, not everything can be perfect, but I think it's a costly mistake to make people ask, what is the point of this? We live in a time where people are more conscious about how they spend their time and how they spend their money. Not only that, but we seem to understand that the companies pumping out these movies don't actually care about us, hardcore fans or casual. When they produce garbage, the argument is that the audience is too difficult to please. What they're really trying to say is that they can't believe the same old strategies aren't working anymore. I can't say that the superhero genre is dying, because if there is one down year, it is immediately followed by a billion-dollar hit the next year. It's just less and less for me, and maybe that's alright. If anything I said resonated with you, please drop a like and tell me if you think I'm onto something or if I need to chill. I'll see you in the next one.